The amount of money that India as a country is spending on agricultural research and extension is very small relative to our problem.
Everybody from a meteorologist to an irrigation engineer to a whole set, including today an AI engineer or an aerospace engineer creating new kinds of drones for Indian agriculture. I think there is many different professions, many different careers that will emerge out of the next sort of nutrition security revolution that I think we're all embarking on. Namaskar. This is the Professor MVP podcast. I am Mahesh Panchagnula from IIT Madras. This is your place for resources that will allow you and help you make informed career decisions. We bring you insightful discussions on various aspects of science, engineering, and technology. This podcast is supported by IITM Global, an initiative of the Office of Global Engagement at IIT Madras. IITM Global is a platform intended to take everything Indian global, Indian enterprise, Indian thinking. Please look at their link in the description below for more. Today's podcast is going to focus on food and agriculture. We're going to dive into the world of farming and farmers and understand how food gets to our dinner table and all of the complexities involved in that whole process. And to help us understand that space, we have Professor Madhura Swaminathan, Professor and Head of the Economic Analysis Unit at the Indian Statistical Institute, Bangalore. Welcome, Madhura.
Nice to be here, Mahesh.
We're very happy that you're here to help us understand this very complicated space. In preparation for this, I've had a chance to sort of read a little bit and talk to a few people and come to the realization that this is a space that many more thinking Indians need to understand. The group of people, our audience, is very keen, discerning young men and women wanting to use this as their resource to make career decisions. So let's start with your own sort of childhood and upbringing. You grew up in a household where the word farming and agriculture were not foreign language at all. So tell us a little bit about how you got introduced to this. Certainly your father, and we'll talk more after that.
Thank you, Mahesh. We grew up, I was born in Delhi, and we lived for at least the first 10, 12 years or more, or 15 years of my life in the campus of the Indian Agricultural Research Institute in Delhi, Pusa campus as it's called. And so we were surrounded by fields and we used to cycle past them and go to laboratories. So I don't think, as young children, we were part of many serious conversations, but we saw agricultural activities around us. And I still remember one story, one of the things, initial initiatives that was started for food irradiation using gamma rays. And the lab had been called Gamma Garden. And we heard about this and kept asking our parents, why aren't you taking us to this garden? Because we thought it was some place for children, and only later learned that obviously it was a facility where one had to be very careful when using this kind of equipment and gamma rays. So I think that there was an introduction, or we were familiar with the problems of food. And I think the one thing, I don't think I had decided to take this career when I was a young girl, but I think one lesson that was taught in our house was that food is precious and you mustn't waste food. So the importance of food, that we were lucky to have enough food on our plate, and we mustn't take it for granted. I think this is something that many of us, when we just order on Swiggy or go to the supermarket, forget. that not everybody has food and that we mustn't waste food and we mustn't take it for granted.
I think let's talk a little bit about the process by which food gets to our dinner table. Uh, we all know food grows in a field. There's a farmer, and then there's the last mile that brings us, the grain and the horticulture, the fruit and vegetables for our household use. At a high level, can we describe this? Can we try to understand this network of people and systems that brings us this food in India?
So I think that's very important, because when we think of agriculture, sometimes we only think of a cultivator or a farmer or a fisher woman, and we think of them as engaged in physical labor and involved in producing a commodity. But food production and the food value chain, or what is now even being called food system, is right from the production stage till the final retail stage, the consumer. And I would say when you start with production, in India today, with a few exceptions, I would say very, very few exceptions, there's a lot of inputs from outside farming, from the industrial or manufacturing sector or services sector, that is going into production of food. How does the farmer get information about weather? From the meteorology department or the government extension service or through a telephone. So inputs into agriculture are from outside agriculture, and so this was in fact a very important issue to remember, that agriculture is not isolated. And then after and during the process of production, there's use of machinery, there's so many other inputs, and then there's what we call harvest, then immediate post-harvest. So once it is, and I think that is where the post-harvest is where we have seen in the last, I would say 40, 50 years of globally absolute transformation, because earlier people ate the produce quite close to what it was when it comes off the field. So your rice is milled or your tomatoes are packed, but that was it. You have a local miller, the rice miller or the wheat miller. You have a chakki in North India, which is, almost in every village or nearby town. But now you have huge amounts of processing and levels of processing, packaging, because food is also traveling more. So you have storage, you have transport. So these are very, very complex and sometimes very long chains. Food is packaged miles away and then is brought to India, or the other way around, or from North India to South India, and so on. So I think that this whole process of getting food, which is the first level of the commodity, whether it's milk or fish or rice, which is produced, then actually getting it to the consumer, getting it to your table or your plate, involves a lot of activities and a lot of persons. Some of them are rural, many of them are urban. You have truckers, people who are transporting it, cold storage operators, and so on. And then finally you may have somebody doing processing or semi-processing. And then finally you may have the shops and the markets and the supermarkets which are selling it. So if you take that chain, then you can see that many, many more people than we think of as farmers or agriculturists are actually involved in this whole food value chain.
Very interesting. If you take this value chain and try to understand it for an urban setting versus a rural setting, are we in the rural setting? Is there still some semblance of the old way of localized networks, or is that also been turned on its head?
I think it is still much more local, in the sense that you don't get the variety of produce in a rural area. So say in a village in Uttar Pradesh, where we spent some time about a year ago, you get Lay's chips and you get a few products of this kind which are being manufactured and packaged. But you don't see the variety of fruit or vegetable or millet or grain or cereal that you would see in a supermarket in Chennai or Bangalore. So it's not that there is no processed food, but it's very limited. The choices are limited. So it's much more locally grown and consumed, at least for the main cereals and staples.
So let's talk a little bit about the different components of our food and try to understand this idea of food security. You've even recently written about it. Um, Rice. Your father completely changed the way we, grow and consume rice in this country. I was talking to a senior journalist, and he said the only reason we are not food secure in, say, a pulses or oil is because they've not seen their own Professor M.S. Swaminathan. Tell us a little bit about your father and his thinking and what went into, all of the hard work that went into making India rice secure.
That's a very big question. Let me just say a few things. My father actually was studying to go into medical school because his father had been a doctor. And after finishing his intermediate, he thought he would go into the medical stream. And that was the time, he was about 18 years old, 17, 18 years old, when the Bengal Famine happened in India. This was in 1943 to 44, 45. And it was the last famine in India. We have not had a famine, luckily, in post-independence India. This was during British rule. There were many reasons and they've been examined. One of the people who has written very incisively about it is Professor Amartya Sen, the Nobel laureate. And the estimate is that at least 3 million people died. 3 million people. And when he heard news, and so it was obviously important news, saw photographs, pictures, heard about what was happening, he decided to change his career and go for agriculture.
Young men and women should never forget these kinds of incidents.
And so he went off to the agricultural college in Coimbatore and then for higher education and so on. And then he studied in Wageningen in the Netherlands. Then he went to Cambridge, England to finish his PhD. And then he went for a postdoc at the University of Wisconsin, Madison. And after the postdoc, he was offered a tenured track job. And he turned it down and he said, I've learned these skills, I've educated myself to go back and do something about this problem of hunger in India. And so he came back and worked largely in the Indian Agricultural Research Institute, but first at the Central Rice Research Institute in Cuttack, as you mentioned. He started with rice and then moved to wheat. So I think I would say that message that kind of imbibed from his life is that you need to be a top scientist, a researcher, engineer, technologist, but then what do you use your skills for? There's got to be a commitment to some problem of, and I think as we are Indians, some bigger national problem that we all have to resolve together in our own way. And of course, you can have a career, you can have good income. Those are all very important for young people. But I think that the science you do, to what problem you apply your skills, whatever those skills are, whether they're in engineering or chemistry or whatever physics, what problem you apply it to is, I think, something that young people should think about.
That's a very nice way to, sort of frame one's own career aspiration. Pick a problem that excites you and that bothers you. As you said, the famine of 43 bothered him to the point where he educated himself, came back. I think that's a wonderful message, even right at the outset, for young men and women to take home. This is a field with a whole plethora of exciting problems that are still waiting for one young Swaminathan sitting somewhere in India to say that is the problem that excites me. And I hope if there is one purpose this podcast serves, it is to excite that one person somewhere in India. Food security has multiple aspects, and you've written about it. Let's talk about India's own situation with food security. Would you say we are food secure for largely, or there are lacunae?
I think we are largely food secure. And there's no doubt that there's been a transformation over the last 60, 70 years in Indian agriculture. In fact, I remember there is a graph that Professor Kurosaki, a Japanese professor, prepared for South Asia, for all of South Asia, over a 100-year period, agricultural production. And if you look at 1900 to 1950, roughly, stagnation. No change in yield, no change in output. No, in India. So under the colonial robe. So it was Pakistan, Bangladesh. It was a bigger India picture. And then you look at the graph after 1950 and just see a complete change, a sharp increase. So I think we don't have to go into the details of agricultural statistics. It was visible what happened. In the 4 years between 1966 and 69-70, yields of wheat doubled, which had the previous doubling had taken 10,000 years. So, I think that is why it's called a green revolution, because it was a totally dramatic change. And wheat, and then it was followed by rice. And so India today is more than self-sufficient in wheat and rice. In fact, we are a big rice exporter. It's bringing in a lot of money now, particularly exports of basmati rice. But as we don't want just rice and wheat, we know we need a diversified basket of food, and people want to have other things along with their roti and chawal. And the two areas, the two crops, set of crops, I would say, that we are still dependent on imports, we're not producing enough, is pulses or lentils. And as you know, some or other kind of dal is part of every Indian's meal, whether it's in North India or South India. We're importing lentils from Australia, from Canada, from different countries, and oil seeds. So we have made huge gains, not only in rice and wheat, but also in milk. We had the milk revolution. We also have big expansion in recent years in horticultural production, in fruit and vegetable, and so on. So we've seen first rice and wheat, then the food basket diversified. 80s and 90s were a period of crop diversification. So if you take the trajectory of the last 50, 60 years, but we are lacking in these two very important set of crops, because there are many oil seeds. There's soya bean, there's palm oil, there's groundnut, there's mustard, sesame, and so on. There are many crops here, and similarly in lentils, there's a whole range of pulses and lentils that are there. So we still have work ahead.
Wonderful. So let's talk pulses. As you said, we import from... In fact, when I was doing my research, came to me as a complete surprise that we import from Australia and Canada, of all places, as you just said a moment ago. How are they able to produce pulses? Or what are the components that goes into, say, pulse or lentil production that really makes it more difficult? Where are the challenges in that space?
If you take lentils and you look at the yield of lentil, that is yield meaning the amount of output produced per unit of area. So in this case, kg per hectare. Sure. So if you take kg per hectare, China or Australia is having 2,000 kg per hectare plus. India has 950 kg per hectare. So our yields are half. So for every unit of land that we cultivate, we produce half what China is producing or what Australia is producing. Now, one thing about agriculture is that it is still one of the activities, we could say, which is most nature dependent, because it's out in the field, and you do have now, I think I must emphasize this, with climate change, a lot of variability. So what is the temperature going to be? What are the rainfall patterns going to be? All these are changing, and weather patterns are changing. So the riskiness of agriculture is going up. But even putting that aside, the conditions under which we are cultivating, and there are many factors, but the low yield is because of one important reason. For example, in India is that pulses are grown largely in areas without irrigation. So these are the less productive soils, as it were. So we need to pay attention to water. And perhaps because there's a scarcity of water, we need to think of new ways or new technologies where we can have, more crop per drop, as they say, to have, more efficient use of water. We need to also think of new seeds and varieties or cropping patterns. So I think a big lacuna in India is research, but even more than research, I would say extension. We have very good scientists and technologists, not only in agriculture, in so many fields. But is what is being done in the lab, is it getting to the person on the ground? It is getting to the cultivator or the farmer. And in fact, I remember years ago, my father, when he was in the Ministry of Agriculture, designed a program called Lab to Land. So there is nothing what is the point of having something in the lab? That is for improvement of scientific knowledge. It's very important. But then you have to transfer it, translate it, make it in a way understandable, bring the product. So whether it's seed, whether it's a technology for water saving, whether it's a technology for new kind of input use, you have to bring or even processing, because very often losses or waste happens in the processing, in the storage, and in distribution. So I think that this translation, the amount of money that India as a country is spending on agricultural research and extension is very small relative to our problem. And I think relative to the size of the problem in terms of not only the number of people, more than 1.4 billion people whom we have to feed, but also, and I think this is something that not everybody is aware of, at least 60% of our population lives in rural areas. We haven't had a census since 2011. It was 69% then. It may have come down a little bit, though we found in COVID that a lot of people went back to the villages. So it may not have gone down very much. But let's say 60% of 1.4 billion. So that's a very...
And a large fraction of that 60% are agriculture dependent.
Yes. They are, I would say, they're engaged in agriculture in some way or the other. In fact, they're not all agriculture dependent. And again, that is the second problem. So I said pulse yield is low. And then you say, but why aren't more people going and investing and doing things? Because the returns from growing pulses are very low. So when your income is low, the next generation in the farming households is trying to look for employment in the cities, is migrating, is trying to move out of agriculture. And I think this is another thing, youth are moving out of agriculture because the youth in rural areas see agriculture, say northern Karnataka, for example, which is Gulbarga district, Kalaburgi district and other places which are pulse growing. It's very dry, harsh climate, hot sun, and they have to grow these pulses, very low yield, low incomes. So they're seeing this as so low in terms of income generation that they don't want that career anymore. So this is a very, very important issue, I think, because if the next generation leave, then our pulse production is going to decline even further. And how are we going to address these shortages? The Niti Aayog has recently done a report called, I think, it's estimating projections of food for 2047. Viksit Bharat, what will our requirements be? And except for rice and wheat and sugarcane, for most other crops, if we follow a business as usual model, we'll not be able to produce enough to meet our domestic demand. And question might be, why not? I can import it from Australia. What's wrong? And I can export something else in return. And here I want to say something which is again not associated with agriculture so much when we think of it as an occupation, is food sovereignty. In fact, it's very important that a country of our size, and if we want some independence in the global order, national sovereignty, we have to be able to feed our population more or less. It's not that we don't import anything or we don't export anything. Then you have a crisis, you have a war, or you have COVID, and we get isolated. You have to have enough to feed your own people. And I think that so declining or low production of pulses and not paying attention to it, just as an example, it can become a very serious problem. And if we, again, and I think this generation of young people don't know about this, but in the 60s, before the Green Revolution, we were dependent on imports of wheat from the United States. Now, tomorrow there may be tariffs and the imports may be double the price. So we as a country of our size, a continent really, a subcontinent, have to be prepared for some giving importance to food production.
So even in this last 10 minutes, I've already picked up that, as you said, agriculture draws from many people from outside the discipline. And these disciplines, already I can see, you need an army of civil engineers to work on irrigation-related problems. You need an army of environmental engineers that can understand the changes that are happening due to climate change and make appropriate predictive models that farmers can now begin to depend on. So I'm beginning to see that the core group of food growers require an outside army of an even bigger army in some instances, and a more diverse army of people that can assist in this whole enterprise of ultimately becoming food secure. I think let's talk about the process by which engineering has come into agriculture, right? So from my research, I see that India is largely a small and marginal land-holding farming nation, whereas even a China or a a US certainly is in a completely different league, are very different. So we are in no position to import the farming technology from a US or Australia or a Canada into India. We have to have our own agricultural engineering. Please tell us a little bit about the way agricultural engineering, or your view of where agricultural engineering is set up in India, and what do you see as the changes that you think we should make to that system of educating agricultural engineers?
Okay, I'm an agricultural economist, but I'll take on engineering. You're very right that the average size of a operational holding, or the plot on which a crop is cultivated in India, is 1 hectare. That is 2.5 acres, which I was told is about 2.5 football fields, for a reference. Whereas it is 1,000 hectares in the US. And there are huge machines. So we can't have the same kind of technology. Having said that, it may surprise you to know that in almost all of India, perhaps not on some mountain slopes or some other kind of a few difficult terrains or some tribal hamlets, ploughing is done by tractors. It is almost universal in India now. So when you have a technology which has been developed, which can be done suitable, then it is adopted very easily. So I don't think there is anything, even the farmer who has 1 hectare or less is ready to take on the new technology if it is available, if it is cost effective. So I would say that designing machinery, designing equipment to operate on small fields, not just small fields, but if anybody has been to a village and you know how land is divided in India across over generations and bought and sold, somebody may have one little triangular plot in one corner of the village and have another plot somewhere else. It's not even consolidated. This is a big problem, I think, in many parts of India, what we call land consolidation, that people will not exchange land and say, okay, I keep this plot and you keep that one. Is that even now with the latest drone technology which is being used, and drones are being used for fertilizer application, for pesticide application, so that it can be more precise and it can go over the field and have the exact location. It's the fields of different farmers are sort of just almost, how can I describe it, crisscrossing, fragmented. And so you would have to design the area at which the drone operates in a little different way. The square meter or the square inch that it would have to take as its unit. As you can see, I'm not a technologist, so I don't know the details. The other thing which is very important, I think, and that's something that has concerned me for a long time, is equipment and machinery for women to operate. And one of the areas of my research for many years has been women's work. And we can see that in India, as the economy develops, many young men are leaving the villages to come to the cities for work, in search of work. And more, women were always in agriculture. Women domesticated agriculture while men were out hunting. That was, millions of years ago. But more and more women are engaged in agriculture. Now, do we have tractors that are suitable for women to drive? Do we have the right kind of equipment? Is that sprayer too heavy to carry on your shoulder? So I think we have to not only think of machinery which suits our operational holdings, but we have to think of who's going to operate that machine.
It's a wonderful point. I think, that's a fantastic point. When we say the word farmer, we have a gender bias built in all our minds, and you are breaking that gender bias. That increasingly we are seeing women come into farming. And what are the other challenges around women coming into farming? You talked of, a few. Are there other societal challenges and implications to this change that you're pointing us to?
Yes, there are, because even now we find that while women are actually involved in different stages of agriculture, they're involved in transplanting rice. You see these photographs of women standing in water. They're involved in processing it at home afterwards, in drying, in taking it to the market, in animal care, husbandry, in milking cows. Women play a very important role in animal husbandry. In fisheries, once the fish is brought from the sea, it's largely still men who go to sea, but once it's brought, it's the women who are cleaning and processing and marketing. So women are playing very many roles, but I think in terms of their educational relative deprivation, in terms of informational deprivation. And I would like to give an example here. We have one of the new forms of technology that's very, very important in agriculture is, of course, digital technologies and the use of information and communication tools. And one of the studies done by the MS Swaminathan Research Foundation, this was about a decade ago, found that women preferred voice messages, because in those days, it was still the old phones, and you had SMS sending information on agriculture through voice messages, because they would listen to these messages when the phone was with the man, when the husband or the son, came home, and when they were cooking. That was the time they got. So while they're chopping their vegetables, they listen to the voice messages which were to do with agriculture, with poultry farming, with soil conservation, with many other activities. So even the time when you can reach women may be different. If you say my news broadcast is at 10 a.m. and they're busy, feeding their children, they won't be able to hear that news broadcast. So the timing, the technology, how you reach them, these are all questions that have to be built into the design of that technology. And of course, we've moved now from phone SMSs to tablets and other things. But I'm saying this is a problem that would apply to any technology. And this is an example of having to take account of women's needs. And I must also add here that in terms of resources, women, but in most of the land in India is not in women's name, it's in men's name. Mobile phone ownership is very widespread in India, but it's still largely in male hands. When you say a family or a household has a phone, but in whose pocket is it? So the other persons may only get access to it at certain times of the day or certain occasions. So I think this inequality in access to resources, that's a bigger issue. And that's an issue beyond the scientist and the researcher. That's a policy issue. But that has to be combined with the scientific or technological innovation that is proposed.
Sure. I think this whole change that I just learned of, that there's an increasing fraction of farmers that are women, and that's going to be the workforce of the future, to take us towards complete food security. Clearly, we need to sort of change our thinking and make sure we are far more gender balanced in the additive technologies that will come on board to help the farmer. We talked about food security at a high level. We talked about where oil and pulses there's still work to be done. Let's talk a little bit about the systemic problems that we have in agriculture that should excite a young man or woman like the famine excited your father. Let's talk at the systemic level. Where are some challenges that you think requires a person or persons to devote their career to?
There are lots of challenges, but let me start with one which I think is important for anybody who's environmentally conscious today, and that is food waste. So food that is waste or loss, that is produced but then not consumed. About a decade ago, there was a very interesting report brought out by the FAO. One of the key authors was an Indian, Dr. V. Prakash, who was then the director of the Central Food Technology Research Institute in Mysore. And when I read that report, I was very surprised that the extent of food waste is exactly the same in India and the US. It's 1/3 of produce. But where it happens is totally different. In India, we call it food losses. It happens between the production and getting to the market. So this is the post-harvest loss. By the time the tomatoes come in that non-air-conditioned truck, half of them are rotten by the time they get to the supermarket, and so on. And every year we hear about apples which are not harvested because they've fallen on the ground. So the losses are happening at this end, whereas in the US, the losses are happening at the consumption end. Restaurants throw away food, supermarkets throw away food, a lot of people throw away food. So it's a totally different problem. Now, our problem, I think, is actually more tractable. Because what are we talking about? We're talking about research on packaging, research on safety, food safety, research on preservation, research on cold storage, research on better transport, research also on sort of just-in-time kind of production. How do you make sure that the produce reaches the market in a right manner with the least amount of damage? Partial processing. We're not talking about highly processed food, but we're even talking about putting tomatoes perhaps into some simple drying processing or other fruits to keep it longer. So I think this is one area where I am assuming there's a lot of, engineering or design solutions that are needed, which is from the time the food is harvested. And this applies to fish or to milk and others, to the time it reaches the consumer.
So that whole, the logistics chain, the cold chain, all of that is still oldish technology that you think is ready for, an upheaval. There's a new way that one could consider thinking about it. One of the, from my research, I was trying to understand exactly that, the value add that comes post-harvest. And I found that, in the West, there's a lot of corporatization. Sorry. The large corporations that have stepped in to help with exactly that part. The post-harvest logistics chain, processing, value addition to bring the product to the food and to the dining tables. In India, we have ITC, that's the one large agri-tech company, but I couldn't find any of that scale, certainly. There may be smaller companies. Is that a direction that you think will help us solve or get somewhere with this problem, to bring more corporate interest somehow through policy?
I am not sure. I mean, I think that the problem in India is a little different from the US in that in the US or in Europe, 2% of the population is engaged in actual agriculture. 2%. And for us, we're talking about 40, 50, 60% in some way. So the corporations are a very different character there, where once the production is done by this 2%, most of the other employees in the ag sector are actually all the people involved in this processing part. Now in India, we have to, and I think this is something very, very important, and I should have said it earlier. When I talked about pulses, I said there are low yields and there are low returns or low incomes, low profits. And there are many reasons for it, but one of the reasons is the small scale nature of production. One farmer with 1 hectare, doesn't know where to get the inputs from, cannot have a processing unit in his or her backyard, cannot hire a refrigerated truck. So I think it's very important what you said. To me, it's important to bring scale to smallholder farming. Now, we have 85% of our small farmers. If one company replaces them, what is going to happen to the livelihoods or incomes of 85% of our population? So we cannot go, we need some companies and we have some role, there are companies to play a role, but I think at a mass level in India, we really want to bring in all these hundreds of millions of people who are engaged in fishing, farming, etc. We have to think of models which will give them scale. So even while they produce individually, they can operate in some kind of collective. Now this is not a new idea. Many people have thought of it. And after independence, we had cooperatives, the idea of cooperatives that people will come together. And there was also a very philosophical part of the cooperatives. But except for a few places in India, some cooperatives in Kerala, some cooperatives in Maharashtra, cooperatives have failed. And it was keeping this in mind that about a decade or so ago, we had a new idea which has been proposed by Indian policymakers called the Farmer Producer Organization, or FPO. So this it can function like a company. Doesn't have to, because the cooperatives, one member has one vote, and there are all kinds of different rules and ways in which the cooperative was functioning is a different philosophy. Now, farmer producer organization, I think in principle is a good idea, because what you're saying is that instead of one hectare farmer, 100 or 500 get together, and then they can take money from a bank, they can find some investment, they can actually either invest in processing or at least even marketing, they can do it in bulk so that they get a price, or they can do some part of the storage. It's a collective effort. Now, farmer producer organizations, there are a few successful ones in India, but it still has not really got off the ground. Again, except that some exceptions are there. So in Maharashtra, there's some very successful ones. So I think we can think of... farmer producer organization really is like a small company, except it's not started by one person. The other thing, I feel that there is a lot of scope for startups, because some of the things we want are new technologies. So, for instance, this whole area of digital agriculture, apps, which a marketing app, so that even for somebody who wants to know the price, or a person who wants to collect produce, you know which farms to go to, because it's not 1,000 hectare farm where you go and collect your produce. You have to go 1,000 of those. So I think that there's a lot of scope for new technologies, which precision farming, the many new technologies, I think, are of a kind which can be applied at a very micro level and a small scale. So when we talk about precision farming, for example, you need a sensor to tell you when to irrigate. That is a sensor for one tiny plot. It's not a sensor which needs 1,000 hectares. So some of those old tractors may be a big ones, but there's a lot of engineering and design and technologies which today actually can be done at the scale of a small farmer and can enhance the value of output of the small farmer. So I think there are technologies now which can do it much more than earlier, because we're not really talking about, there may be a few places where you need big machines or big trucks, but it's not, you can do things at a smaller scale. And also you can get better value by operating on larger produce. So we have some examples I'm trying to remember, where there are plants. There is a plant in Kerala that is doing fruit pulp. And they know where their producers are, and they message them the day that the fruit is ripe, and they collect it and bring it to the processing. So now with our phones, we can do this. So you can reduce the waste, and you don't have to send your truck out every day. You send it on the day when the fruit has to be collected, and you can ship it in and process it. So I think that there's actually a lot of scope for bringing higher value and giving scale to the small farmer than earlier. And because we have hundreds of millions of small farmers, we need to do that, not just rely on corporates.
Wonderful point. I think I'm beginning to see the distinction between a farmer-producer organization and a corporation. As a little bit of an aside, I happened to read a book recently about the Cholas and the business structure that the Cholas had. They had these large craftsman guilds called Shreni, hundreds and hundreds of, let's say, bronze sculpture makers, and they would come together, and they were exporting their wares to, dozens of countries outside India. And it's, from what you now described, they sounded very much like a farmer-producer organization in some sense. The distinction at a layman level, I'm not an economist, at a layman level, what I am seeing is the distinction between a farmer-producer organization and a corporation is that there is no leadership, a management leadership that a corporation comes with that has sort of a top-down structure that is there to sort of deliver shareholder interest, or deliver upon shareholder investment and interest. If only the farmer-producer organization can develop that leadership, and this book that I'm alluding to talks of the leadership that the Cholas had in their Shrenis. They were elected by the farmers or by the craftsmen to be on a board for a certain number of years, and that board basically acted like a representation of the larger guild of craftsmen. This leadership of farmer-producer organizations, if you can comment on what is required, I can easily see that if that leadership was capable and able, there's no distinction between that and a corporation in some sense.
I think you have hit the nail on the head. The failure of leadership or failure of management, because leadership without resources or without knowing accounting practices or it's more than just having a good leader. Because when you go to the villages, you meet some people who are so knowledgeable and they know what the problems are, but it's being able to put together a system. I think management is a little bit more than, one leader. This is why when the whole milk production expanded in Gujarat, I'm talking about many years ago, and you had what is called the White Revolution, and Verghese Kurian was the director in charge of Amul, he started IRMA, the Institute of Rural Management at Anand, with exactly this purpose, that those who were doing MBAs in the top institutes were going into the big companies, and he wanted a cadre of people who would do rural management. And IRMA graduates used to be in all the banks earlier, because the banks used to give agricultural loans and they would go and assess them. But I think we need people like that. I don't think there's too much difference between rural management and urban management, but it's a sectoral skill perhaps. We need management graduates. We need people with management expertise to take on jobs in FPOs. I fully agree with you that it's very difficult for the person who is spending all day deciding on, should I harvest today? Is there enough rainfall? How should I keep my crop in a better condition? To actually also have to be thinking about tomorrow when it is harvested, how am I going to dry it and sell it and market it? So I think there's a big role for people with management expertise.
We've already added one more profession to the list of people that should, there's an exciting prospect for them to come change the way our FPOs are structured. You talked of digital agriculture. Digitization is coming into agriculture in a big way. And for a fragmented landholding country like India, I can see digitization is going to be a great benefit to small and marginal farmers. Help us understand what digitization can do and where are the opportunities in that space.
Digitization is a word being used for a range of things now, starting from artificial intelligence to sort of developing apps to be used, and I'm not sure, but the whole range of things over here. And each of these has a role to play. And I'd just like to say something about the AI, because I'm sure young people are interested in AI in agriculture. That one of the features of the Green Revolution was that new varieties of rice and wheat were developed, which were dwarf or semi-dwarf, so shorter than earlier, and shorter duration. So less time for cultivation and, more yield and less stock. Today, AI is being used to go through the germplasm collections in the world. For example, the rice collection, which is held at the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines, and I happen to be a board member there now, to look for traits. To look for traits in wild rices and the whole huge variety of rices from all over the world, such as traits for better nutrition, traits to bring about low glycemic index for diabetes. So there's a huge lot of work that can be done, which is, of course, at the first level, at a scientific level, before we're thinking of a product or an output that is reaching the farmer, but can really speed up and give us new ideas on what kind of crops to develop, how to make them more nutritious, how to make them, say, less using of water, because we know water scarcities are going to go up, and how to grow more in the context of climate change with less resources. So you have many challenges which are coming at you, and these can be used. At a more practical level, and coming to something which is being done a lot, particularly by young people and groups and startups, is things like digital phone apps. So in the cities, we have a lot of apps, but what are the apps for agriculture? So about 10 years ago, the MS Swaminathan Research Foundation, based here in Chennai, in collaboration with partners, developed an app called Fisher Friend app. And this was one of the big partners they collaborated was with Indian Meteorological Department and INCOIS, the Indian National Center for Oceanographic Information. And the idea was to give real-time information on wave depth, on these sea, various features of sea, and the temperature and climate to the fisher folk when they were out on the sea. And this could actually have two roles. One, it could prevent accidents. And in fact, the case of tsunami, those who were using this app got a warning, the Indian Ocean tsunami, but also tell them where to go safely, where at the depth at which the fish can be found, and actually increase the output and the productivity of that fisher person. Now, the way this app was developed, very interestingly, in those days, the first thing that was done was voice messaging. Because again, when you're out in the sea, you can't be reading the text. You've got to be looking all about you. So it was voice messaging. It was also graphics on wavelength and so on, because some of the people may not have been very literate. So I think this is something that has saved lives, improved incomes, and been involved, giving the real-time information. I think today with remote sensing and so many other satellite information and weather change, as I mentioned, climate change is such a big problem which is affecting all of us in agriculture, first of all, because it's out there in the open. Even a house could be flooded, a factory could be flooded, but the field is flooded first. So I think getting and using real-time information, modeling it, putting it into a form that can be absorbed by and sending messages out, perhaps even graphically or voice messages to the people on the ground. So we will always have this gap. We need scientists and technologists, but we need, I think what startups I see are doing are also seeing how that can be marketed to the last person, So to me, that seems to be something that startups do, which is take something which is small scale, which has high-end technology, but make it very simple and usable for the final consumer. In this case, it could be the fisher person or the farmer or the woman farmer. So I think there's very, very exciting possibilities because on the one hand, the kind of information that you're getting in the world, that you're getting from satellite data, this information is increasing day by day. India has a regular plan of satellites being released. So the kind of information, the quantity, the intensity is increasing. And this information can then be used in a way that would actually help somebody who's on the ground, who is farming.
The world of AI draws heavily from data that's already available. As you said, there's data from outside the farmer's own footprint, satellites, maybe some telecommunication data. But there is data that the farmer himself or herself is likely to sort of produce or generate. Are farmers, how good is that data at the farmer level? Do they even keep track of how much seed they sowed, what was the produce they got? Is that data sort of available with the farmers?
The farmers are very, very aware of how much their seed has quantity, the cost. In fact, this is because this is the biggest issue about farming in India today, is that it's not, for the actual farmer, it's not very remunerative. And that's why these young men are leaving farming. And because it's seen as something which will barely give you something for survival. There are a few exceptions. There are a few crops in a few parts of India where it's not the same. But by and large, I would say the agrarian economy is in distress. The incomes, and now that it's women more than men, I think the incomes have even, perhaps even lower. They are aware, but I think we don't have systematic accounting practices and we're not keeping records. Now, one of the things which is very important, and that is being done, I must say, even by Indian Meteorology Department and many state governments and others, is that we have to start collecting information on local weather patterns, on local, let's say, groundwater. Because a satellite may tell me something, but I need to verify it with what is happening on the ground. And so I think this two-way flow of information, how do we take the information from the field level? How do we take it and model it and then bring it back as this is the right package of practices? That is something which is very much in the early stages. And that has just started in other countries, like in the US. So you have remote sensing data and then there's ground truthing. And because the models that we have don't actually have the farmer's knowledge in them. So that information, what exactly is the problem with the elevation on the farmer's field, or there are some stones in the middle of the field, or any other problem, this information has to be come back into the models.
That's exactly what I had in mind. So you're saying we're not very far behind where the world is in that space. And, Indian entrepreneurs can step in, make a change or make a difference to not just India, but solve a problem for the world at large. Since synthesizing ground truth data, as you said, to, with satellite and other external data sources is still an unsolved problem in some sense.
I think it's a very, very big research challenge at present is that all the modeling of the impact of climate change on agriculture is coming out of global models based on global assumptions. And this is something that we need Indian models to be developed. And similarly, Vietnamese models or something. I'm not saying India is special, but what are our conditions? What are the actual facts on the ground? And these assumptions that are being made, we need to question them and we need to put our data into those models and develop new models, which then can be used by other people in the world. And I think Indian scientists in many disciplines have made this kind of contribution at the global level. And if I can talk from something which is in my field of economics, after independence, particularly in the 70s and the 80s, the question of how to conceptualize and measure poverty, any student in any part of the world in India was reading Indian economists. Because our problem was so big that all the top minds were thinking about it, and whether they were in the planning commission, whether they were in the universities, and developing theories and concepts and indices and measures which are now applied in all parts of the world. So I think that if we realize that it's a very serious problem that we have to address, I'm sure that this next generation can actually tweak that global model or change that global model based on what our conditions are. And there's no doubt that with our population size, with our footprint in agriculture, in most crops, we're either number one or number two in the world. Yes. And in some cases, most cases, China is number one. They're a bigger country and bigger population, and a few others, maybe US or something. So given our size and our footprint in agriculture, I think that the solutions that we develop here can actually be path-breaking for other parts of the world.
Absolutely. My own research for a long time has been in sprays. And you, a little while ago, talked about how Indian agriculture needs extra precision spraying because the land holdings are so small. That's an engineering challenge in itself that, I'm able to take home from this conversation. So in some sense, the solution, if we are able to solve this precision spraying problem, it's solved for the whole world, not just for India. I think we have that opportunity to test out solutions here that are rather unique will be rather unique for the whole world. People like Professor Swaminathan come, once in 100 years. For a large country with 50+% of the population either directly or indirectly dependent on farming and agriculture, this is as critical a pursuit as it is for a country. We need a large number of smart and committed minds. And you've talked of the idea that these minds don't need to be all farmers. They have to come from multiple disciplines. And you just added another discipline, that we need AI scientists and researchers that would come in, take an interest in agri problems. What do you think we can do to help the cause of identifying and exciting talent? You talked of Verma, that Professor Kurian started. Uh, what are some things that we can do today that will bring in committed and excited talent into this broader sphere of agriculture and food technology?
Let me step back for a minute and just, for the sake of our young audience, tell them that about 72% of South Asians, that includes India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, cannot afford a healthy diet. And I'm using this term healthy diet because it's not just rice or wheat, but it's in a whole variety of things and nutrition and fruit and vegetable. I think, to me, this is our biggest problem. It's shocking. And India is 18% of the world's population and 30 or 32% of the world's people who cannot afford a healthy diet. So it's a challenge. It's also shameful. It's something we need to do urgently. We need to take this up. Having said that, I think that whatever the discipline you're in, it could be chemistry, it could be computer science, it could be engineering. There are opportunities related to food and agriculture in India, in ensuring that people get adequate income, that we have enough production, that consumers get a healthy diet. So the different parts of the chain. And I think one of the failings perhaps of our Indian educational system, and as I speak as someone who's been in the public educational sphere for so many years, is that we are a little in silos. We don't speak to each other.
Yes.
And we are in big silos. The agricultural universities are a different system. The state agricultural universities, they're very good, but they come under the Indian Council of Agricultural Research. You have your IITs, then you have your other central universities, then you have your state universities. So we have, even within academia, we are not talking to each other enough. And I think one of the things I would say is, if in some way we can break this barrier and have some kind of interaction, whether it is optional courses, whether it's visits, how it's going to be done, I'm not sure. But break this barrier between having agricultural university students, having engineering students, having liberal arts students in a different setup, and or economics and management schools differently. Second thing I would say, and this is something that I have done with my students and a lot of young people over the last 20 or 25 years, make a trip to a rural area. Go to a village. And don't just go in the morning and spend a few hours and come back. Stay for a few days. For the last almost 20 years, a group of us, colleagues and students, we have been going on village visits and research visits, surveys actually, very systematic statistical surveys in different parts of India. And we've only covered about 28 villages because, we have to do 1 or 2 every year, so it takes time. But what I've seen is that a student from Delhi or Calcutta or Mumbai or Bangalore, Chennai, our students are generally, the volunteers who come for this are from the top universities in our big cities. It changes their life. Spending a couple of weeks in a village changes their life. Some of them may be in academia, some may go into some business, some may leave the country. It doesn't matter. But it is a life-changing experience. And you may or may not take up a problem related to rural households and agriculture for the next 10 years of your career or even later. But I think, what are the problems? What are the everyday problems very visible. And I would like to add one, which is drudgery of women's labor. We talked about the big agriculture problems, about yield and about income and costs and resources and groundwater. But when you see the kind of work that women are doing in agriculture still, because as you know, when a new machine comes, when new equipment comes, when a drone comes or something, it's the men who are going to take it first because it's new and it's something worth trying, is something that I think in this century we cannot have people working this way. And here we have huge advances, as you mentioned, in a variety of technologies, and we have to take them to our farm women.
Beautiful summarization. The national education policy talks of exactly what you alluded to. They use a phrase called MERU, multidisciplinary education and research universities. I think the policy has come to the realization that having these siloed universities, IITs, is no longer sustainable or even good for the greater good of the country. So I think we are all moving in that direction. I'm hopeful that one day IIT Madras would have a department of agricultural, or at least agricultural, a department that's related to agriculture. The second idea that you propose, that everybody should go spend some time in a rural setting, is fantastic. I'll request my producers to collate a list of internship opportunities and leave those links in the descriptions for anybody that wants to take up on the offer that Professor Swaminathan is making. The last point you made with working on the drudgery of women's, sort of easing their day. The government of India has a program called the Drone Didi program. So I think we need many, many, many more such programs. In fact, some time ago, a colleague of mine pointed to a change that happened in the gender bias. My parents' generation in schools were all taught by male teachers. And today, you go to any school anywhere in India, it's mostly women who are teachers. And, there are theories as to how this happened. And you are alluding to a possible shift in that same direction, in that same sense, of that same magnitude happening in farming. As we come close to, this very, very interesting podcast, and I've learned many things already, what would your advice be to somebody who's listened to this and says, he's still got one last question on their mind? Is there a career here? Career, we all have to be very clear. I have a family. I want to make sure my family is comfortable while I am serving a greater cause. Is there a career here? And what sort of careers you see emerging in the next 20, 30, 40 years that a young man today can say, that's not a bad career to be in. That's a good career to be in.
First thing I think is, for any young person is, and those who are just joining college, is to find something you really like, your subject, what it's going to be. Whether it's going to be computing or whether it's going to be engineering, and what type of engineering, or it's going to be economics. So I think find something that you like and that absorbs you and interests you. And I think that's the skill set. And this years of your college education, your university education, is to develop the skill sets and to develop how to gain new skill sets in future, because I think that's something also you learn. I think the question then is that, and so choose your career based on that. But I think whichever career you choose, what problems do you apply your skills to? And I know that there are startups in India, there are tech companies in India who are working on problems that link to agriculture though they are sitting in offices in Mysore or Bangalore. Like fitting a camera onto a tractor so that you know whether the crop is ready to be harvested, and training that camera on your information to to get the right kind of images. So I think we have to stop seeing first agriculture as just something which is happening on the field. And I think we started with that today when we said it is from before the crop is grown. What are the inputs? Where are the seeds coming from? To where does it finally get to my plate and in what form? So we have to start thinking about food and nutrition. In fact, the term that people use now is food and nutrition security. We don't even say just food security, because we've gone beyond just having enough rice or wheat. We want, healthy diets. So once you start thinking about this whole chain, then the kind of applications or the kind of problems that you're going to is so many sectors of the economy.
Yes.
So there's exports of produce, as we already talked about, there's logistics, there's transport, there's engineering, there's so many aspects of the economy that come in, because food is the most essential commodity for human beings, and we can't be without food. So it starts from climate modeling, I would say. What crop should you grow? So we need people who know sophisticated physics and climate modeling, who can also apply their problem to agriculture. And I think it is exposure, and that's why I talked about keeping your eyes and ears open, because if we see food only as something I get in the supermarket, then we don't see the challenges in the food sector. And whether you are in whatever discipline you're in, your management discipline, there are problems that you can see that relate to the food economy and how to bring better quality food, more nutritious food on every person's plate, not just on your plate. So I would end with that. I think perhaps that is a lesson that we sort of imbibed from my father. When we were told that, is he was concerned about food security of every person on the planet. Not just about Indians. Indians to begin with, we had to solve our problem. So I think if you have a concern which is beyond us, yes, have your career, do something that you like and that you find interesting, but see if you can also address one of the biggest challenges of the globe.
Fantastic. I think again, in India, as we become more and more an agri-produce exporting nation, the value add for every individual goes up, and their own value also as a result increases, and careers more interesting and increasingly remunerative careers will likely result from that headroom that will be created by the export prospect. I think this has been a fascinating conversation. The fact that the farmer is not acting alone was my first takeaway, and there's multiple professionals, everybody from a meteorologist to an irrigation engineer to a whole set, including today an AI engineer or an aerospace engineer creating new kinds of drones for Indian agriculture. I think there is many different professions, many different careers that will emerge out of the next sort of nutrition security revolution that I think we're all embarking on. Thank you so much, Madhura. This has been an absolutely educative and fascinating conversation. I enjoyed every bit of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mahesh.
This has been a fascinating conversation with Professor Madhura Swaminathan, Professor and Head of the Economic Analysis Unit at the Indian Statistical Institute, Bangalore, and formerly chairperson of the MS Swaminathan Research Foundation. We covered a whole range of topics, starting with where agriculture was, where farming was pre-independence, and the Green Revolution in the 70s and 80s, and then talked of all of the allied disciplines that come together to make agriculture, the enterprise around agriculture, a vast economic activity for this country. From irrigation engineers to drone engineers increasingly and AI engineers in the future, this enterprise is unlike any other enterprise in India. It encompasses about 60%, between 50 to 60% of the country's population, either directly or indirectly, contributing to this vast enterprise. It has been a fascinating conversation, and I hope this has left you with some information that talks to you that there are viable careers to be made in the broader discipline of agricultural engineering and engineering agriculture as an economic activity. This is the Professor MVP podcast. This podcast is made possible by the efforts of a large um, ecosystem of stakeholders. Please find their links in the description below. I am Mahesh Panchagnula, signing off. Until we meet again, be well and do good. Namaste.